So, you're trying to convince someone that God exists. You're probably overwhelmed with the amount of information and approaches other theists recommend. You need a starting point. As an atheist myself, I've become pretty familiar with the popular arguments for God's existence, both because my theist viewers send them to me literally every day in comments and emails, all that. Thanks, guys. And because it's important to me to seek truth in studying arguments contrary to my position. That's why I've decided to create a guide that will illustrate and rank the power of each of the more popular arguments for God's existence. Although I've found all arguments for God I've encountered so far to be logically or evidentially problematic in some way, I do see some arguments as better than others. Here I'll rank popular arguments by their stats in 4 areas. 1. Intuitiveness, the ease at which the mind comprehends or even instinctively believes the concepts at play. 2. Fallacy aversion, the extent to which an argument avoids utilizing logical fallacies and or hides them well within its premises. 3. Communicability, the ease at which the argument is communicated to others and or its ability to capture attention when communicated. Finally, 4. Refutation resistance, the extent to which an argument presents a challenge to refute, whether by means of complexity, emotiveness, or high-level rhetoric. I'll briefly cover 6 arguments, 1 in each tier. For those unfamiliar with this tier system, F tier is least powerful while S tier is most. There's obviously a lot of subjectivity at play here, so feel free to create and explain your own ranking in the comments. In F tier, we have quite possibly the most popular argument on this list, at least when it comes to my comment section, Pascal's wager. The argument goes, if someone believes in God and God doesn't exist, a person suffers only a finite loss in death. But if he does exist, they enjoy an infinite gain in heaven. Meanwhile, if a person does not believe in God or act as if God exists, they stand to gain finite luxuries on earth, but stand to suffer infinitely in hell. Therefore, a rational person would seek to believe in God and live as if he exists. This is commonly put as a theist proclaiming to an atheist, if I'm wrong, I lose nothing, but if you're wrong, you lose everything. This argument commits a black and white fallacy, asserting that only 2 alternative states exist as possibilities, while other possibilities in fact exist. This argument can be easily destroyed by pointing out that multiple mutually exclusive religions could use this argument, thereby making its nature absurd. This argument is remarkably communicable. Its simplicity, ease of comprehension, and emotiveness have literally seen it turned into a bumper sticker. That simplicity is its downfall, however, as its fallacies are so blatant and its refutation resistance is so low that it can be and has been refuted by the likes of Homer Simpson.
And what if we pick the wrong religion? Every week we're just making God madder and madder.
Testify!
With no special abilities and wildly unbalanced stats, Pascal's wager lands squarely in F tier despite its popularity. In D tier, we have the ontological argument. There are several forms of this, so I'll address its first, Anselm's ontological argument. It goes like this. God is the greatest possible being that can be imagined. God exists as an idea in the mind. A being that exists both in reality and the mind is greater than one which only exists in the mind. If God only exists as a concept in our mind, then we can imagine something that is greater than God, a greatest possible being that does exist. We can't imagine something that is greater than the greatest possible being we can imagine, therefore God exists. Yeah, that one is a pretty wild ride, so in case you're confused, ontological arguments essentially boil down to saying a greatest possible being exists somewhere, a necessary criteria for the highest possible greatness is existence, therefore a greatest possible being, God, exists. This argument commits the fallacy of begging the question, as its conclusion is already included within one of its premises. Its first premise says that a greatest possible being exists, and eventually concludes that a greatest possible being exists. It claims God exists after simply defining God as existent. The ontological argument relies upon its decent refutation resistance stat. It deceptively appears complex, giving the impression that its refutation would also need to be complex. It still does not hide its fallacies well, however, so it ultimately makes poor use of its confusability. Like Pascal's wager, this argument's strength is also its downfall. It's rather unintuitive, and its wordiness makes it difficult to communicate to others. Because of this, it's most often used in its syllogistic form by apologists. Given that its only decent stat and ability ultimately backfire, making it difficult to use, Anselm's ontological argument only makes it to D tier. On to C tier, where we find the Kalam cosmological argument. This argument is very popular among Christian and Muslim apologists, as well as many theists with a more cursory knowledge of apologetics. The Kalam states, whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. That's all of it. Other arguments are often used in conjunction with the Kalam in order to support the idea of a specific God, but still, the Kalam is well recognized as an argument for theism. Strangely enough, this supposed argument for God is not actually about any deity at all. Even if the entire argument was granted, it still wouldn't support theism. Further, even if granted, it wouldn't establish that the universe's cause was itself uncaused. The Kalam, if true, would only establish that the universe had a cause, but would say nothing at all about the nature of that cause. Proponents of this argument will often state that the Big Bang was the beginning of all space, time, and matter, and thus the beginning of causation. Therefore, the cause of the Big Bang must have been uncaused itself. This misunderstands the Big Bang, though. See, we don't exactly understand the Big Bang to be the beginning of all that is. It isn't the moment where something came from nothing, as some mistakenly assert. We've traced the expansion of the universe backward, and the Big Bang is simply the point where our understanding of the laws of physics no longer makes sense and we can't trace back any further. So, yeah, the Kalam cosmological argument fails to establish a first cause, much less any deity. It is rather intuitive and easy to communicate, giving it an edge over the ontological argument. It also has greater fallacy aversion and refutation resistance than Pascal's wager, although that's not really saying much. The Kalam's unique feature is its ease of communication in its syllogistic form. It isn't confusing or wordy, but it still sounds smart. With low-level but not terrible stats or abilities, the Kalam cosmological argument lands in C tier. Okay, now we're getting to the arguments with some fight in them. In B tier, we have the argument most often used to justify bigotry toward non-believers, the moral argument or argument from morality. There are several forms of this argument, but a common syllogistic form nowadays is this. If God does not exist, objective moral values don't exist. Objective moral values exist, therefore God exists. This argument's first premise is unsubstantiated. It doesn't demonstrate that the only way objective moral values can exist is if God exists. This is simply a non sequitur. Some who use this argument may define objective moral values as moral values declared by God, but that would make the argument state its conclusion within its second premise. That would commit the fallacy of begging the question. The argument would be circular reasoning. God exists because God ordained moral values exist because God exists, and so on. Some other moral arguments, such as C.S. Lewis' argument in Mere Christianity, state that moral law has not been shown to have a natural origin, so it must have come from a supernatural moral lawgiver. First of all, this is an argument from ignorance. Not knowing does not excuse asserting an unsubstantiated answer. Second, evolution by natural selection is actually a pretty good explanation for why social species would behave according to practices which promote fairness, peace, and well-being among groups. This argument is similarly intuitive, communicable, and fallacy-averse to the Kalam cosmological argument. What sets this argument apart is its higher refutation resistance aided by its special ability, denigrate. While not always fully taken advantage of, the denigrate ability is used when this argument's user asserts that non-theists lack morals because they lack a belief in a god. This, to many, makes non-theists appear untrustworthy when they try to debunk the moral argument. After all, an amoral, godless liar probably would try to convince people that God doesn't dictate morality or doesn't even exist. That way, they can get away with all of their evil actions undisturbed. With mid-level stats and an occasionally effective special ability, the moral argument goes in B tier. I already know that my A and S tiers are going to be hotly contested, but I think my cases for these are pretty solid. In A tier, we have arguments from personal experience. I know, I'm sure plenty of you take issue with that, but please hear me out until the end. Arguments from personal experience aren't usually presented in syllogisms, but if they were, they'd probably go something like this. My personal experiences are reliable sources of information. I personally experienced, insert God claim here, therefore, the God claim is true. There are several issues with the first premise here. Personal experiences are not always reliable. One, personal experiences can contradict reality. There are hallucinations, manic states, meditative or trance states, psychoses, and more that can inform delusions. There's a wealth of scientific evidence that shows this to be true. 2. Different people's personal experiences often contradict each other. Just ask all the Muslims, all the Christians, all the Hindus who have all had personal experiences in which a god confirms to them that following their specific religion is the only way. 3, and perhaps most importantly, a plethora of cognitive biases exist which influence perfectly sane, healthy, and honest people to misinterpret their mundane, naturalistic experiences all the time. 2 fallacies are very common among interpretations of personal experience. The first is thinking that one thing caused another just because they happened in sequence. This is drawing false correlation, or post hoc ergo propter hoc. The second is positing an unsubstantiated explanation for an occurrence just because you can't explain it otherwise. This is an argument from ignorance. So, with all these flaws in this argument, why do I put it in A tier? It has the absolute best intuitiveness and refutation-resistant states out of any argument for God. Human beings naturally trust their personal experience. It is, after all, the primary source we use to inform countless decisions on a day-to-day basis. This means that even well-educated, intelligent people often trust their personal experiences over more reliable sources like scientific data all the time. If someone has a gripping personal experience related to God, they're probably going to believe it regardless of who they are. Personal experience is also incredibly hard to refute, given that it isn't possible to place oneself within another person's experience in order to point out any definite logical fallacies being made. On top of that, augmenting its refutation resistance, this argument may have the strongest special ability there is, attaching to identity. See, if you attempt to argue with the interpretation of someone's personal experience, they often take it as a personal attack as they associate that personal experience with their very identity as a person. Their personal defenses go up, rendering any further debate entirely useless. This argument has low fallacy aversion, but because of how convincing it is given its other stats, that doesn't really matter. Its real weakness is its lack of communicability. Personal testimonies do sway some, but for the most part, those who value personal experience aren't strongly convinced of things from hearing about other people's experiences. Many theistic groups have learned to compensate for this weakness, however, in creating environments which are conducive for personal experiences with God. Think prayer and fasting sessions, physically intense rituals, communal worship, and group excursions. If you still doubt that this argument belongs in A tier, go ask a few theists why they believe, then ask them if they would still believe if the reason they gave was not at play. If they say they'd still believe, repeat those questions until they say no or refuse to go any further. This is a street epistemology technique for figuring out why people believe what they do. My bet is that you'll land on personal experience that way the majority of the time. With extremely high intuitiveness stats, an overpowered special ability, and solid strategy to compensate for its weaknesses, arguments from personal experience earn a solid spot in A tier. Finally, we're up to S tier, where only the most effective arguments belong. At this tier, I'm going to place the teleological argument, specifically the argument from fine-tuning. It goes like this. Cosmology shows us that there are several physical constants that govern the universe as we know it. If any one of those were tweaked even the smallest bit, the universe as we know it would not exist. The constants as they stand form a proverbial Goldilocks zone for our existence. It's highly improbable that this would occur by chance without a fine-tuning creator, so it's more probable that a creator does exist and is responsible for this fine-tuning. While this seems to make sense at first, deeper inspection reveals this argument's simple flaws. First, it makes use of a false dichotomy, presenting pure chance and an intelligent creator as the only two possibilities when it hasn't successfully ruled out other options. There could perhaps be some purely physical rule to the universe which demands that these constants be the way they are. Second, this is an argument from ignorance. Because the arguer doesn't know how such an unlikely thing could have possibly happened, they posit an unsubstantiated explanation, a god, instead of saying, I don't know. This argument has high balance stats. Its intuitiveness is second only to personal experience. Research within the field of cognitive psychology suggests that teleological thinking naturally occurs even in children. Humans naturally conclude that there is intent behind the function of just about everything, living, non-living, inanimate, or not. This type of argument is so intuitive that most cultures around the world have come up with some form of it independently. It's also very communicable, as it lends itself to colorful analogies like the watchmaker analogy, and it spawns stories that become religious dogma, aka creation myths. One of its special abilities results from its high communicability and decent refutation resistance. That ability is giving purpose. It gives its user a feeling of uniqueness, privileged status, or purpose. The user thinks that they were designed intently by an intelligent creator. This makes challenging the argument difficult, as any challenges may trigger the user's personal defenses. Those challenges will appear to the user as attacks on their personal sense of purpose, as assertions of hopeless nihilism, or both. This argument also has the ability to retreat to gaps in the knowledge of any who would try to refute it. If a teleological argument is used on the level of biology and evolution is invoked to refute it, it may retreat to the level of chemistry, then physics, then cosmology as a whole, always avoiding direct refutation. As long as there's something about the existence of the universe that we don't know, this argument will rest safely in that ignorance. Even when this argument has been debunked, it won't appear so to many. The refutation of this argument demands that its opponent admit ignorance, which can appear to some on the argument's side as an admission of defeat. Given its high intuitiveness, its ability to turn its fallacy into a cheap victory to some, its incredible communicability, and its refutation-resisting ability of turning any challenge into an attack on its user's existential security, the teleological argument belongs in S tier. So, if you're intent on convincing someone that God exists, hopefully you now better understand some of the tools at your disposal. Although, if you're like me and feel that the more you've come to understand about apologetics, the less comfortable you are actually using them, then at least consider, for a moment, getting out of this game altogether. Now, I'm really curious to know what you guys think. Would you rank these differently? For you, has this been a fun way to explore apologetics like it's been for me? Do you hate me for being some kind of Tier Zoo offshoot? Let me know in the comments. While you do that, let me just say thanks for watching. I've been Drew of Genetically Modified Skeptic. Go ahead and subscribe, check out my Patreon, follow me on Twitter and Facebook at GM Skeptic, join my Discord, and until next time, stay skeptical.